From the moment he entered Havana in 1959 with a group of bearded rebels until his death in 2016, Fidel Castro remained the most iconic figure in Latin America. In his signature military uniform with a thin Cohiba cigar and hours-long speeches directed against Uncle Sam to resist the influence of the United States as a superpower, Fidel Castro captured the imagination of future revolutionaries and millions of people around the world. It wasn't enough for him just to rule Cuba. He tirelessly worked to spread his ideas. For decades, his global network of allies and supporters grew. It included leaders such as Salvador Allende in Chile, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization. El Comandante, as he was called by his supporters and the press, was a symbol of the leftist revolution of the 20th century. He would probably be turning in his grave if he found out that today, the most recognizable Latin American leaders in the world are not leftist revolutionaries, but right-wing leaders from the opposite ideological camp. Javier Milei is a self-proclaimed anarcho-capitalist, the president of Argentina, who waves a chainsaw as a symbol of his determination to drastically cut the state apparatus. And Nayib Bukele, the bearded millennial generation leader of El Salvador. Instead of the ubiquitous Cuban revolutionary slogan, "Forward to Victory," is now replaced by Milei's libertarian slogan, "Long live freedom, damn it." It appears on t-shirts in college towns across the United States and is even quoted by politicians in Israel. Like Castro in his time, both leaders achieved much greater success than their countries on the world stage. Milei became the first head of state to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump after his victory in the 1924 election, receiving a lavish reception at the Mar-a-Lago residence. Trump called Milei "my favorite president," and in October granted Argentina a financial aid package of $20 billion, the largest loan given by the United States to any country in 30 years. Milei's success in dismantling state bureaucracy and excessive regulation helped reduce inflation in Argentina from over 200 when he took office in 1923 to about 30 by the end of 1925. This is recognized as a model to follow. The leader of the British Conservative opposition, Kemi Badenoch, and the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, as well as many other representatives of European right-wing forces. This has also made him a kind of guru for the libertarian titans of Silicon Valley, in particular for Elon Musk, who demonstratively waved Milei's chainsaw on stage at a conference of American conservatives. Meanwhile, Bukele's tough stance against gangs in El Salvador has made him an extremely popular figure in Latin America and beyond. Even though he unapologetically dismisses concerns about due process and human rights. In a 2024 poll, 81% of Chileans rated Bukele more positively than any other world leader, and more than twice as high as their own representative. Bukele has over 11.6 million followers on TikTok, more than any other head of state except Trump, who currently has 16 million followers. The real revolutionary fervor in modern Latin America, where leaders are determined to transform not only their own countries, but the entire region, is primarily evident on the political right. After the victories of conservative forces, the traditional camp of order, the market, and national interest, which opposed itself to leftist experiments and state paternalism, has asserted itself. In several recent elections, and given their strong chances in other campaigns next year, the region seems ready for a once-in-a-generation shift, one that will fundamentally change the approaches of states to fighting organized crime, economic policy, and strategic relations with the United States and China. In 2025, President Daniel Noboa was re-elected. Milei's party achieved an unexpectedly convincing victory in the key midterm parliamentary elections in Argentina, giving his agenda even more momentum. In Bolivia, with the election of Rodrigo Paz Pereira, a centrist reformer, nearly 20 years of socialist rule came to an end. Conservative presidential contenders are leading in the polls in Costa Rica and Peru, and are within striking distance of victory in Brazil and Colombia in elections scheduled for the end of 2026. Latin America consists of about 20 countries with distinct histories and political dynamics, and right-wing forces will not necessarily prevail in every single case. However, there have been moments in history when the region moved more or less in sync. Reactionary dictatorships that swept through in the 1960s and 70s after the Cuban Revolution. A great wave of renewed democracy. The democratization of the 1980s and the pro-market reforms of the Washington Consensus in the 1990s. And the so-called Pink Tide, which in the late 1990s and early 2000s brought Chavez and other leftists to power. Today, another similar regional realignment is taking shape, challenging some of the most fundamental assumptions the outside world has about Latin America. As a result, the region may soon pursue a more aggressive policy toward drug trafficking and other types of crime. It will be more favorable to domestic and foreign investment and pay less attention to climate change and deforestation. And overall, it will align its priorities with the Trump administration on issues of security, migration, and limiting China's presence in the Western Hemisphere. Given the history of American intervention in Latin America, one might expect that the emergence of a hardline nationalist right-wing U.S. president would spark a rise of leftist resistance in the region. Instead, for now, it is not the Latin American leaders who condemn and challenge Trump who benefit the most from his return, but those who admire him, flatter him, and even try to emulate him. In our previous video, Why is Latin America so poor?, we discussed the reasons for the region's economic decline. This video is about how a new right-wing revolution is taking shape in Latin America. Leaders are coming to the forefront who are breaking old rules, embracing free market economics, order, and hardline security. We explain why, instead of leftist resistance, the rightward shift is now winning, what the new conservatism means, and how American influence is reshaping the region. Friends, we have an ambitious goal to reach 200,000 subscribers on the channel by the end of 2026. You might have been watching us for a long time and not even realize that you haven't subscribed. Subscribe to our channel and tell your relatives and friends about it. Also, give us a like and leave a comment under this video. We thank all our donors, patrons, and sponsors on YouTube. Every hryvnia you donate brings Ukraine closer to economic prosperity and well-being. Because we are not just making videos, we are enlightening voters who will choose real reformers. Help us with this. The support link is in the description. The rightward turn can hardly be explained as just another minor political cycle or a short-term pendulum swing. Analysis of polling data and underlying trends points to something bigger. Conservative ideas and corresponding political priorities are truly gaining attention in Latin America. The annual Latino Barometro study by the Chilean Regional Center, which surveyed more than 19,000 respondents in 18 countries, recorded a telling fact. In 2024, the level of citizens' self-identification as supporters of right-wing views reached its highest point in more than 2 decades. The same survey also showed the distribution of political sympathies. The most popular politician in the region was President Bukele of El Salvador, who received an average score of 7.7 out of 10. On the other hand, the lowest level of support by a wide margin was recorded for Nicolás Maduro, the socialist ruler of Venezuela, whose rating was only 1.3 points. Most of the reasons for the rise of right-wing forces are rooted in the Latin American reality, which has become harsher in recent years. Crime is the #1 issue. It's an old wound for the region, but recently it has reopened. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, global cocaine production in 2023 reached a record 3,708 tons, which is significantly higher than the figures from 10 years ago. The lion's share comes from Colombia, where production increased by 53% in just 1 year. These volumes turn drug cartels into financial giants with private armies, and drug trafficking fuels a wave of violence. Latin America makes up about 8% of the world's population, but it accounts for a third of global homicides. In countries preparing for elections, including Brazil and Peru, security consistently tops the list of voters' concerns. And this issue traditionally benefits the right wing, who promise order, toughness, and quick solutions. Religious transformation also plays its part. The spread of evangelical Protestantism in a region where Catholicism dominated for centuries has changed the political landscape, especially in Brazil. The topics of abortion, gender ideology, and cultural values have moved from the sidelines to center stage. Add to this the collapse of Venezuela and Cuba. Their years-long economic and social collapse has seriously undermined trust in socialist models in the minds of an entire generation of voters. Even moderate left-wing politicians are coming under fire, as they are often perceived as part of the same ideological camp. The mass exodus of people from Venezuela, Cuba, as well as from crisis-stricken countries like Haiti and Nicaragua, has caused unprecedented migration within the region itself. In Chile, Colombia, and Peru, this has sparked a wave of discontent, which right-wing candidates often skillfully convert into political dividends. And finally, the image factor. The global recognition of Milei and Bukele has become a separate catalyst, even if most voters do not seek to emulate them. In copies of their radical models, there are viral videos where the president of El Salvador is greeted like a rock star at the White House, or speeches at prestigious events, such as the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos, create the impression that the right is not only gaining ground at home, but is also confidently entering the international arena. In politics, sometimes just this sense of forward movement is enough for the pendulum to finally swing in a new direction. For decades, right-wing politicians in Latin America operated in the shadow of the Cold War. Their opponents always reminded people of the dictatorships of the 1960s to 1980s, when regimes like Augusto Pinochet's in Chile, Hugo Bonzer's in Bolivia, or Efraín Ríos Montt's in Guatemala were accompanied by large-scale repression and killings under the banner of fighting communism. After the wave of democratization in the 1980s, the right tried to distance themselves from this legacy. Themes of strongman rule and order were often avoided so as not to sound like echoes from the past. But today, the landscape has changed. If you look at the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index for 2024, among the clearly defined authoritarian regimes in the region are the predominantly left-wing governments of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. At the same time, countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Mexico are classified as hybrid regimes. This has blurred the old formula. Right-wing equals dictatorships. The emergence of center-right presidents who operated within democratic institutions also played a role. Specifically, Mauricio Macri in Argentina and Sebastián Piñera in Chile. Their terms did not destroy democracy. On the contrary, they demonstrated that conservative policies can coexist with institutional constraints. At the same time, public attitudes toward democracy itself are also changing. In various Western countries, there is a recorded decline in unconditional support for the democratic model. Studies show that some citizens are willing to tolerate authoritarian alternatives, especially in times of economic instability or rising crime. According to a survey by the Pew Research Center, on average, an average of 31% across 24 countries support authoritarian systems. This trend is not unique to Latin America, but it is there that it gains political significance. Another transformation concerns social policy. The right no longer appears to be the party indifferent to the poor. The COVID-19 pandemic became a turning point. In Chile, the Piñera government introduced large-scale support packages, which were among the biggest in the region. In Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro significantly expanded the Bolsa Família cash transfer program, despite having previously criticized it. The most radical experiment is currently taking place in Argentina under the leadership of Javier Milei. He is aggressively downsizing the public sector, having laid off 15,000 workers and cut spending. His government has achieved the first budget surplus in many years and a new agreement with the IMF. At the same time, the economic reforms are accompanied by protests, disputes over the poverty level, and concerns about the concentration of power. In public discussions, citizens admit Inflation has subsided, but prices remain high. The social impact is still painful, and although left-wing forces in Latin America are still associated with more generous social policies, this advantage is no longer as significant as it once was. The right wing, having partially shed the label of elitism and anti-democratic tendencies, are increasingly shifting the focus to their stronger points. And one stands above the rest: its security. Over the past decade, drug cartels have transformed from shadowy players into parallel states. According to the video, the World Drug Report by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, in 2023, global cocaine production reached a record 3,708 tons compared to 902 tons in 2013. The number of users has risen to 316 million, which is about 6% of the world's population. This is a historic high, and yet another confirmation that the drug market is not shrinking, but expanding. The idea that cocaine only flows north to wealthy partygoers in Berlin, London, and New York is less true today than ever before. Drugs are increasingly moving to the east, west, and south. Although North America is still the leading market, accounting for about 27% of global cocaine consumption, Europe ranks second with 24%. Latin America and the Caribbean account for 20% of global consumption, according to UN estimates. Asia accounts for about 14%, and Africa about 13%. They are also home to rapidly growing markets for this drug. The changing geography of trafficking, in turn, has led to significant changes in smuggling routes, especially those leading to the Pacific coast, turning once relatively peaceful Latin American countries such as Chile, Costa Rica, and Ecuador into battlegrounds, as Caribbean drug cartels fight for control over seaports and other key transit hubs. With record profits, the drug cartels are diversifying their activities. In addition to drug smuggling, this includes racketeering, kidnapping, illegal mining, timber smuggling in the Amazon, and trafficking of migrants heading to the United States. The consequences turned out to be shocking, even for a region that has lived alongside drug trafficking and armed groups for decades. In January 2024, footage spread around the world, showing armed militants storming a TV studio in Ecuador, taking journalists hostage right during a live broadcast. The country was essentially in an internal war with drug cartels. The Ecuadorian city of Durán, near the main seaport of Guayaquil, is now considered one of the most dangerous in the world. The murder rate there reaches about 148 to 150 per 100,000 people per year. For comparison, that's almost the level of the Colombian city of Medellin in the early 90s during the time of Pablo Escobar. In Colombia, political violence has revived fears of a return to the bloody past. In Chile, the situation has also changed. According to surveys from 2023, more than 85% of citizens admit that they avoid going out in the evening, and only about 8% feel completely safe. Costa Rica, which for decades prided itself on its lack of citizens, lack of a standing army, and its image as a tourist paradise, has experienced an increase in murders of more than 50% since 2020. The country has become one of the key transit hubs for cocaine to North America and Europe. It's no surprise that in such conditions, tough-on-crime politicians are gaining popularity. When the level of fear rises, voters start looking for quick solutions. Since Bukele came to power in 2019, the murder rate in El Salvador has dropped to historic lows. According to official data from 2023, the rate was about 2.4 murders per 100,000 people, compared to 105 murders per 100,000 people in 2015. Now, this is one of the lowest rates in the Western Hemisphere, comparable to Canada. Public support for tough measures remains high. In Chile, about 80 respondents said they were willing to support a state of emergency with temporary restrictions on freedoms in order to fight crime. In Brazil, even after a large-scale police operation in Rio de Janeiro that resulted in over 100 deaths, most city residents called it a success. Moreover, the support was equally strong both in the favelas and in wealthy neighborhoods. Meanwhile, politicians who fail to maintain public safety increasingly risk seeing their approval ratings fall. In Brazil, polls show that President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's weakness in fighting crime is a significant obstacle to his re-election in 2026. In Mexico, the murder of a mayor who was outspoken in fighting crime in November 2025 sparked a wave of street protests and harsh criticism of President Claudia Sheinbaum, who takes a tougher stance against the cartels than her predecessor, receives lower security ratings from voters than in any other part of Brazil. In Peru, in October 2025, men on motorcycles opened fire at an Agua Marina concert, injuring 4 children. This attack was the last straw for President Dina Boluarte, who already had low public support due to corruption scandals in her government. A few days after the attack, the Congress of Peru unanimously voted to remove her from office, citing permanent moral incapacity. Before leading the country, she represented the Marxist party Free Peru. At the time of her resignation, her approval rating was about 2%. Despite talk of a rightward shift, left-wing political forces in Latin America remain competitive in elections throughout most of the region. Their main argument is the fight against economic inequality, which will likely always resonate with voters in a region consistently described as one of the most unequal in the world in terms of the gap between rich and poor. According to the World Bank, Latin America has remained one of the regions with the highest Gini index for decades, indicating significant income inequality. The higher the index, the greater the inequality. As of 2024 in Brazil, it is around 0.52 in Colombia, 0.54, which is significantly higher than in most EU countries. For comparison, in Germany, it is 0.32 in Poland, 0.28, and in the Czech Republic, 0.26. By the way, Ukraine also has a low level of income inequality at 0.22. The United Nations Regional Commission, ECLAC, reports that the poverty rate in the Latin America and Caribbean region is 27.3% of the population. In 2023, 172 million people were living in poverty, and 66 million of them could not afford a basic food basket. Under these conditions, the message of social justice retains its electoral appeal. Among the left, there are also popular democratically elected leaders. The president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, won in 2022 by a narrow margin in the second round, receiving 50.9% of the votes against Jair Bolsonaro's 49.1%. Although today, according to the polling company Datafolha, the level of support for his government has dropped to 24%. These are the worst results for the left-wing leader in all 3 of his terms in office. Nevertheless, he announced his intention to run for a 4th, though not consecutive, presidential term in 2026. In Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum gained international recognition for her restrained but firm stance in negotiations with the United States on trade and migration. She won the 2024 election, receiving over 61% of the votes, the highest percentage in the history of Mexican democracy. Her party, Morena, maintained control of Congress, which shows that there is structural support for the left-wing project, not just personal popularity. In Chile, President Gabriel Boric has approval ratings between 25 and 35%. This is not a high figure, but it is not catastrophic compared to the global crisis of trust in governments. Similarly, in Colombia, Gustavo Petro's approval rating is around 35 to 40%. In many countries, it is the left-wing forces that are currently in power. And in recent years, incumbent governments in Latin America have generally found it difficult to get re-elected, which is part of a broader global trend among democracies. The current changes may be less about the classic left-right axis and more about the rise of populists and populist outsiders of various ideological backgrounds. Research by Latino Barometro shows that trust in political parties in the region remains below 20%, and the level of satisfaction with democracy hovers around 30%. This is fertile ground for outsiders and anti-system candidates. Skeptics, however, point out that it's not certain the right-wing wave will turn into a real political tsunami. In Brazil and Colombia, the right-wing spectrum is fragmented. An excess of candidates can scatter the voters' support, which opens the way to a second round, where an overly radical conservative candidate risks losing to a more moderate opponent from the left or centrist camp. President of Ecuador, Daniel Noboa, initiated a 2024 referendum on a package of security reforms, including the possibility of allowing foreign military bases in the country. Some of his proposals received support, but a number of sensitive changes sparked resistance. This demonstrated that even in a security crisis, society has limits to its willingness to accept a concentration of power. Ironically, one of the biggest risks for the conservative shift could be President Donald Trump of the United States, who actively brought the region back into the focus of American politics. However, Latino Barometro shows that his average rating in the region was only 4.2 out of 10. Trump's foreign policy is provoking unexpected consequences. Tough trade measures against Brazil and public statements in support of Bolsonaro have led to a rise in nationalist sentiments. After that, Lula's support in domestic polls temporarily increased, while Bolsonaro's position weakened. Similarly, Trump's statement about intending to take back the Panama Canal negatively affected the rating of Panamanian President José Raúl Mulino, even despite his pro-American orientation. The political ground in the Western Hemisphere today resembles a tectonic plate quietly shifting underfoot. Washington is no longer just an observer, but an active player in the Western Hemisphere. The decision of the Trump administration to support Argentina's financial stabilization was seen by many observers as a factor that strengthened the position of Javier Milei's camp before the elections, increasing the sense of external confidence in his agenda. The reaction to the tough anti-narcotics crackdown was no less telling. In an interview in January 2026, he stated that strikes against drug cartels could take place anywhere in Latin America. Despite disputes over the legality of certain actions, the administration at the same time acknowledged that there were no legal grounds for strikes against ground targets in Venezuela. But that did not stop the U.S. from carrying out airstrikes across the country, capturing President Nicolas Maduro with his wife, and putting him on trial in New York on charges of involvement in narco-terrorism. The obvious message was that, once again, the broader anger against drug cartels and the widespread public rejection of Maduro outweighed other public concerns. In Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum was forced to publicly emphasize the results of the fight against the cartels, responding to signals from Washington. This indicates that even countries seeking to distance themselves from American interference are still drawn to this tough security agenda. Of course, the pull of this hardline security policy remains strong. If the rightward shift truly gains momentum, as current trends suggest, its consequences could be far-reaching. History already has a precedent for this. At the beginning of the 21st century, a coordinated wave of leftist governments reshaped the region's economic course, establishing new forms of regional coordination. At that time, a group of broadly aligned leaders, including Chavez, Nestor Kirchner, and Lula, managed to block a trade agreement across the two American continents that was being promoted by U.S. Presidents Bill Clinton and George Bush. The leftist presidents of Latin America implemented stronger social policies to ensure a fair distribution of the commodity boom of that decade, lifting tens of millions of Latin Americans out of poverty and providing more resources for education and healthcare. The shared political views among the governments at that time gave impetus to more active regional integration. In 2008, the Union of South American Nations was established. The Union is intended to develop trade within the region, strengthen social cooperation, and create its own platform for decision-making without the involvement of the United States. However, in the late 2010s, when left-wing governments lost power, the new state leaders considered this union to be too ideologically driven. As a result, the organization effectively ceased its active operations and lost its political significance. Today, many observers are betting that a similar transformational shift, but this time to the right, will lead to a wave of more business-friendly policies across Latin America. After the so-called lost decade, the region needs a breakthrough. the region's economy will grow. It grew by an average of only about 1% per year from 2014 to 2023, which is the slowest growth rate among any major emerging market bloc. At the same time, venture investments in Latin America in 2023 fell by 84% compared to the peak in 2021, which was one of the deepest declines in the world. Against this backdrop, more and more politicians are promising a deregulation shock. Following the example of Milei, Rafael López Aliaga, the mayor of Lima and a leading candidate in the elections in Peru, has publicly called Milei the savior of the economy. In Colombia, right-wing journalist Viquita Vila, who will run in the 2026 presidential elections, has brought Axel Kaiser, a former advisor to Milei, into her campaign. In Chile, conservative José Antonio Cast, after his victory, announced a plan to cut spending by $21 billion and the deregulation of the economy through tax incentives. This is the deepest political shift since Chile's transition from the Pinochet regime in 1990. According to him, this plan will help Chile achieve 4% annual GDP growth, which is twice the pace of recent years. Modern Latin American history is generously dotted with austerity reforms and investment breakthroughs that have been dashed by waves of social discontent or simply a lack of political support. It is enough to recall the Argentine debt crises of the early 2000s or the mass protests in Chile in 2019, which called into question the country's market development model. At first, they were against the increase in public transportation fares, but then they grew into the largest protest movement the country had seen since the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. Investors often overestimate the ability of even the most charismatic leaders to quickly overcome the region's chronic structural problems: low productivity, educational gaps, and widespread informal employment. According to the World Bank, labor productivity in most Latin American countries is growing more slowly than in East Asian countries, and the average level of school preparation remains lower than that of the countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thus, 75% of 15-year-old children do not reach the minimum level of proficiency in mathematics, compared to 31% in the countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And yet, financial markets greeted the possibility of a rightward shift with enthusiasm. One of the key regional stock indices, MSCI Latin America, had the best performance in 2025 with an average return of 38.9%, which investors interpret as a bet on rapid economic growth and higher corporate profits under more market-oriented governments. Meanwhile, there's growing discussion about the region's resource potential. With more pro-market leaders at the helm, the region may be better able to realize its potential as a supplier of critical minerals. Latin America holds between 50 and 60% of the world's lithium reserves, concentrated in the so-called lithium triangle of Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. These countries, along with Peru, have about 67% of proven reserves with significant and low-cost brine production, which supplies a critical component for important batteries.
Компонент для акумуляторів електромобілів.
In addition, the region has significant oil and gas deposits. From Brazil, which produces about 3.5 million barrels per day, to Argentina, where the Vaca Muerta field ranks second in the world in shale gas reserves with approximately 8.7 trillion cubic meters, and fourth in shale oil reserves with about 16.2 billion barrels. Against this background, investment signals from Silicon Valley look symbolic. OpenAI announced its intention to invest up to $25 billion in Argentine data centers and artificial intelligence-related projects, which the media interpreted as a sign of confidence in Milei's economic course. A possible rightward shift could also change the geopolitical balance. Over the past 2 decades, China has become the main trading partner for a number of countries in the region, including Brazil, Chile, and Peru. At the same time, the United States remains the largest investor in the region. American companies have announced investment projects totaling $223.4 billion US, which is 10% more than the previous year. China remains second in terms of declared foreign direct investment, with $93.3 billion. However, the activity of Chinese companies has noticeably decreased. The value of their new projects in 2024 has decreased by 56.6%, compared to the peak in 2023. The Trump administration increased pressure on its allies, demanding that they limit Chinese investments in sensitive areas, particularly in telecommunications and port infrastructure. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called the recent financial aid package for Argentina part of a new Monroe economic doctrine. He alluded to the 19th century principle about the undesirability of outside interference in the Western Hemisphere, and stated that they, quote, do not want another failed or China-controlled state in Latin America, end quote. Washington is particularly concerned about the Chinese space station in Argentine Patagonia, which was leased by China in the 2010s. The United States has repeatedly expressed concern about its potential military use. Some observers suggest that financial assistance from Washington may have been accompanied by informal conditions, such as a requirement for Buenos Aires to possibly shorten or terminate Beijing's lease on the space station. In a broader sense, Trump seems determined to clearly demonstrate his intention to build a clear system of incentives, financial support and preferences for allies in Latin America, and tariffs and sanctions pressure for opponents. The question is whether the new generation of regional leaders will accept this carrot-and-stick logic, or continue to maintain a position of non-alignment. Starting from the 1990s, a generation of leftist leaders personally got to know each other at events such as the São Paulo Forum, the conference of leftist groups founded by the Workers' Party of Brazil, which contributed to their regional coordination in the following years. Today, many representatives of the new right-wing forces in Latin America are also establishing close ties, particularly at events such as the Conservative Political Action Conference, which originated in the United States in the 1970s and has actively spread in Latin America in recent years. Among the guests at regional events were Javier Milei, Nayib Bukele, representatives of the Bolsonaro family, as well as the Chilean politician José Antonio Cast. Despite the fact that the Conservative Political Action Conference has different formats in different countries, the trend is clear. A common ideological ecosystem is being formed, where right-wing leaders exchange messages about security, the market, and traditional values. Some analysts hope that these social connections may develop into coordination on issues of trade, infrastructure, and the fight against organized crime. Ultimately, this shift may lead to radical changes in a number of other issues as well. One of the most notable social shifts in the region is the rapid growth of Protestant, especially evangelical churches. Brazil is a striking example. In 2010, Catholics made up about 65% of the population, while Protestants accounted for 21.6%. By 2022, the share of Catholics had decreased to approximately 56.7%, while Protestants had increased to about 30%. Evangelical voters have become a significant electoral bloc. Therefore, social issues such as abortion, gender inequality, and the role of the state in moral matters may become significant in the new national politics of the region. In July 2025, Javier Milei helped open one of the largest evangelical churches in Argentina, designed to accommodate about 10,000 people. In his speech to the congregation, he quoted the Bible, Max Weber, and economist Thomas Sowell, emphasizing the connection between Judeo-Christian values and economic freedom, which influenced his government's policies. This is not just a religious gesture, but a political signal. Right-wing forces are actively working with religious communities as a mobilization base. The right-wing shift could also influence climate policy. A more conservative Latin America will likely be less concerned about deforestation in the Amazon, which has fluctuated sharply in recent years depending on the government. The issue of migration is also becoming more acute. Chilean politician José Antonio Cast previously proposed building a barrier on the country's northern border and deporting illegal migrants, especially from Haiti, Venezuela, and other countries. According to estimates by the National Institute of Statistics of Chile, there are more than 300,000 illegal migrants living in the country. Such statements were considered fringe in the region just 10 years ago, but now they are increasingly heard in mainstream discourse. Latin America is living in a state of political uncertainty. The main trend is instability of electoral preferences, fragmentation of party systems, and a high demand for change. And in this sense, the region is not drifting in one direction. Here, the one who survives is the one who can convincingly speak about bringing trouble spots under control. Governments that are able to show a firm hand in fighting crime or economic chaos gain a measure of trust. Those who appear powerless risk losing power illegally, regardless of their previous successes. A rightward shift could become a continent-wide experiment, or it could once again crash against the old reefs of inequality, institutional weakness, and political polarization. Fiscal discipline, police repression, and the fight against narco-terrorists are entering the political discourse more loudly than issues of social justice, which have been pushed aside by demands for order and security. If today's generation of right-wing leaders can gain and maintain power, they believe they can create a Latin America that will shed its global reputation for crime and stagnant economic growth, and will work more closely with like-minded governments in the United States and Europe, and ultimately will be safe and prosperous, so that its citizens will want to stay rather than seek a better life elsewhere. This is not a revolution in the sense of Fidel Castro, but it just might be a systemic restructuring of regional identity with profound consequences that will significantly impact the future political landscape. We read your comments carefully. Write in the comments whether Latin American countries should get rid of leftist governments and choose right-wing conservative politicians. This video was made possible by Atlas Network's support. The author's views in this video don't necessarily reflect Atlas Network's opinions.